I lied.
Do you guys want to do a Google Doc just to put, like, we don't have to use it, but like, just as a class to have
Yes.
everything in one place? I can make it.
Because we don't have to talk, we can just type in the Google Doc.
No.
I like
Do it as a
that.
silent conversation.
Just like someone
For me, it would be really interesting.
Yeah.
I think even Tom will appreciate that one.
What are the goals? What?
MASK09.
What are you? I might have you. What? Eating currently. Currently at gmail.com.
Alright, there are markers that are here.
Maybe Elizabeth. Yeah. Gone.
No.
Oh, Colby, where are you?
Do you not remember mine?
No, it was today, so it's in the system. What's the first letter?
D.
I'm gonna find it. Wait, what's the next one?
Just give it to her so we can
Tumus
move on. I would like to be done with
Wait,
this.
slow down.
DUMUST.
Oh, that's it. I knew it was something like that. Jonah Gold.
Jonah Eagle, 18.
Mine's
Wait, I thought I had you.
Westcott, 29.
Got it. Ezra?
EGOF 2020 at spyponders.com.
What?
Wait, then I don't think you can do it.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's a Gmail. Put that in Gmail.
At Spy Ponders?
Yeah, it's a Gmail. What?
Rom?
Rom, Dr. Booker.
Alright.
I like that one.
Simple. Sweet. Efficient.
Okay, you all have it now.
Yeah, but I don't know if my password for my email is.
Oh my
That
God.
sounds like a personal. Oh, and Matan, but I don't have his. I have.
What's
Ooh, I'm in.
something 205?
Matan, we got you. Yes, I turned around and looked. Just to make sure he understood.
So nullification.
What about it?
Alright, so I'll just,
Seems like you're the leader of this company.
I don't want to be, I just created the doc, someone else can. I can say something to get it going, yeah, alright. So the climate in 1830, like basically like just as a quick overview, looking at the timeline, it's clear that after 1830, the abolitionist movement really ramped up, and slavery as a whole was more threatened, including like the sudden rise in abolitionism propaganda, books like Uncle Tom's Cabin, Kansas and Nebraska being able to determine their own slavery, Abe Lincoln, like these are, I'm just, no specific event right now, just like the way the timeline goes, it's clear that things really picked up after 1830, and then suddenly in 1860 when South Carolina seceded and everyone followed, like it's understandable because of how much pressure there was to like emancipate slaves by that point, but it wasn't as hot of an issue 30 years earlier.
Well, I do think that's in regards to as to why the southern states decided to eventually come together and say we need to join in to solve a few problems. I would say that it's mainly because that at a particular point, well, throughout the course of the 1800s, especially in the right from the start of the market revolution, the North was industrializing rapidly. There were, I remember there were some of the maps that we looked at for homework once. most of the railroad concentration was in the north, and it was very cheap. Like it used to be the case where trying to ship goods from one place to another within the states costed as much as to transport those goods across the Atlantic Ocean. But with something such as railroads, and also not to mention the vast number of canals that were constructed throughout the same time period, it really gave the North an advantage in economic development. Not to mention that most immigrants were coming to the North, and that could also give it a slight like a political edge, as in it could probably outvote most of the things that the whatever the South votes for.
I think.
What did the two things have to do with each other? Can you explain that more?
I would think in regards to abolition, I think the eventual road to civil war is, yes, slavery is one of the bigger issues, but I do see it somewhat more of as like a vehicle, and another conflict, or like one of the more defining features of this conflict, which is again federalism versus states' rights.
What does that have to do with immigrants coming in?
That so the North was experiencing sort of a population boom at the time. The more immigrants were coming to the North, and that's mainly because if the immigrants move down south, they're going to have to compete with slavery, which is somewhat impossible. And I think, like, that more people in particular could probably mean more votes.
Immigrants can always vote.
Immigrants could always vote?
Couldn't.
Could. Are you sure?
Yeah.
I'll
They
look
always
it
get
up for y'all.
citizenship. They weren't seen as white. We don't have to focus this on this.
Well,
I'm just
most of them, like
confused.
Germans or
But they weren't seen as white.
But I think just to Abigail, to your point, which I think is exactly right, that if you're going to make a claim, which is fine that you're making a claim that immigration leads to increased population and increased voting, you want to make sure that just factually speaking that is correct. I think it's a fair question. So yeah.
Yes.
I actually want to point out on talking about railroads, what I found kind of interesting and just doing background reading on this is in the ANSCO book on 239, how it talks about the Panic of 1857,
Oh, right.
which talks about, how the northern economy wasn't doing as good, or at least it wasn't it wasn't doing as well as the southern government. The southern government was becoming comparatively more autonomous.
Right.
And it seems like it's weird to reconcile those two ideas. In fact, it kind of shows that there's some sort of change happening now.
When panics happen, usually what happens is that people think that things are going better than they actually are. And that doesn't necessarily mean things are going badly. It just means that they overestimate the success of it. So perhaps because of all the things on paper that we've talked about with railroads and immigration, people saw the North as this like economic powerhouse, whereas in reality, like the quote unquote, I hate to use the word traditional, but like more like traditional like Southern like economic system of slavery was more steady, and with the growth of slave states, that steady nature of their economy continued to grow at a fairly predictable rate, whereas the northern economy was more volatile due to the fact that they had, like another example is like Matthew Perry going to Japan. There was these like external elements that could greatly increase the economy, but also at the same time it's a little unclear how successful those ventures would be, and it ended up turning out that a lot of those ventures didn't pan out the way that people thought they would. And so I think that's one of the biggest reasons of why the Panic of 1857 happened, was because there was just such a massive like kind of like almost like a hype train of the economy in the north that just didn't pan out.
So what does that have to do with secession? Sorry, I just want to make sure I understand that.
Well, my point is that the southern government, I think, we talked about this earlier in the year, how the southern government and the northern government kind of like become almost two entirely distinct cultures and societies. And I think that the southern government, the more things that happen that make the volatility of the northern economy happen, the more the southern government realizes how different they are from the north. And since it's a slave society, everything's based around it, the more things the north does, like we talked about, making the railroads and mass repair going to Japan, I think that just increases the divisions between the two.
So are you saying industrialization?
Yes, yeah, industrialization.
Okay. And just adding on to that, do you want to specify what kind of industrialization? Do you think it's more what replaced what would have been slavery? There's a very clear progression of innovation in the north that goes from more effective ways to do simple things to factories and bigger buildings and more concentrated living environments. So is there a certain aspect of that you think was it more just innovation as a whole took this off and put it into fruition, or?
I think it's hard to say one specific thing, but I think with the cotton gin being created and that increased the textile,
for,
the increase of the textile government, the textile industry. I think that really added to this aspect of these rich northerners owning these big factories and these also rich but planters in the south.
So being rich and modern affects the psychological self-acceptance.
I'm not saying that's necessarily true, but just the way that the north and south saw each other is that they were totally different.
It's a hypothesis about psychologically how they felt about okay.
But why would that lead to succession directly, or why would there be a motivation to split on official terms rather than just cultural?
Well, I think part of my hypothesis is that because, sorry, I don't want to hijack this whole conversation, but I think that part of the biggest reason why the Panic of '57 happened was largely due to the North, and I think that the South was kind of just sick of it being in a place where they didn't really have control over their own they wanted self-autonomy, right? So so clearly they were sick of the Northerners bullshit, basically.
Jealous or sick of it?
I'm not sure. I don't know, but they clearly didn't want to be part of them anymore.
Do you think if it what do you think stopped them from wanting to combine forces with them then? Because they see how successful they are in a much more.
But they weren't though.
Okay, and if they looked at them and they were we're sick of their bullshit, what stopped them from being they're doing something right, they're successful too. Why was it we have to separate from them? Where's the transition point between being parallel but on different tracks, and then the North and the government in general threatening to restrict the way that their economy works? Where does slavery come into it? Where does just the mandating laws and controlling them kind of tip them over? You know what I mean? Because totally valid that they saw the North as different. They're successful but in a different way. But why then? Why?
What does that have to do with secession?
Yeah, well, why 1860? What made them so angry that it was then?
I mean,
And legally, governmentally, and politically, how does that all?
I think that what I probably should have tried to specify at least before launching into what I had to say. I think that through this new industrialization, through all these railroads and canals and whatnot, it incentivized more cooperation between the northern states. And as I've kind of seen it with like humans being social animals, cooperation tends to help us a lot more than just letting each and every one of us do our own thing. So I think, so to keep it into context, like the nullification crisis happened around 1832 to 1833. At that point, like the effects of industrialization have already started, but they weren't totally felt. A lot of the railroads that we see today were still being constructed, and also South Carolina was the one that kind of threw the biggest fit over the tariff of abominations. I don't know what else it's called, and it was mainly like a tariff. It didn't and it affected each state differently, so there really wasn't a cause for secession at the time. I'll let other people try to fill in a second, like as to why the South decided to eventually group together.
I feel like we haven't talked about like the obvious thing, which was like the formation of the Republican Party, because then all of a sudden it was like political, and like all of these people who were against slavery were on one side instead of it being like Northern Democrats. Like it was like these people don't want slavery anymore, and they were rising to power. And so I feel like that threat also of like people coming to power that could suddenly abolish slavery, like that is scary for people who want to protect their slavery. And I think that was another incentive for them to leave, because they don't have the threat of the Republicans if they're not part of the Union.
Well, I would probably say that even though there may have been like a strengthening in the political perspective of slavery, as just like looking at slavery through politics, it's kind of always been there. So, like especially with the Whigs and the Democrats, there was like a sort of both of them were united by party, but when it comes to issues such as slavery, the Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs, and also Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats tended to kind of there was like a schism, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, is like the parties that existed previously didn't all 100% agree within the party, and by the formation of the Republican Party, which was founded because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it was like this huge group of people that suddenly all of them wanted to abolish slavery. It wasn't like, oh, only people from the North. It was like Republicans wanted it, and they were viewing power.
I think having it definitely as like an explicit stated political goal mattered, but it seems weird that when you get that, like when there's this sort of split in it seems like that's when the two cultures split economically. The reason why I think the South would actually feel aggressively has less to do with growing difference and necessarily a feeling of revenge, but probably in the reactionary steps the North might take. Which is to reinstitute those sort of tariffs to offset whatever sort of economic loss is happening up there. Because that's sort of a theme in the South is that the North will increase taxation to offset the losses there.
So were they mad about taxing?
Or just preparing for the freight of it, not necessarily that it had happened. I actually don't have any research
Right.
which
Okay.
shows that.
But okay, that's a very fair point. Like, zooming out a little bit, do you think that like part of their desire to secede was at all like it's hard for me to not keep going back to the abolitionist movement, because I
Right.
really feel like
Well,
I'm
and-
just so like slavery is so on my mind, which is what tipped over the scale,
Right.
Like it just made them feel unwelcome. Like first, like the government lets Kansas and Nebraska decide for themselves, and then they're like, it just keeps ramping up, and they're like, oh my god, like this is our economy. So then you bring in industrialization, and like it all under slavery, everything is threatened. It's like a domino effect. at least in my mind, like, correct me if I'm wrong or you disagree, but like, it's just like, what's the driving force?
Yeah, I mean, you really have to try to figure out, I mean, like, this is incredibly radical. You have states that are deciding they no longer want to be part of the country anymore. And they know full well that they're likely going to have to fight for this. They saw, you know, their grandparents in the Revolution doing the exact same thing, giving up enormous amounts of, you know, money and their blood, etc., to make this happen. So, like, what? Like, this is a really radical. Like, what pushed them to this? I mean, you have to be convinced that you get it. This is not just simply like, let's go out for a walk one day. It's a serious thing. What could have driven them there?
I mean,
Sorry.
there is sort of in a lot of the charts we've seen this weird proliferation of slavery and slave populations leading right up to the secession, and it could be that a lot of the wealthier people in the South were buying and on some level believing that slavery is just an inferior way of doing things and that it will be outmoded, and they acted sort of like, I don't know if you know, but like, you know, Exxon and a lot of major oil companies have recently, where they know that they're going to go out of business, so they increase industry as much as possible in those regards and cheapen their prices and try to push everything to the 100% limit of expansion before there's some sort of crash.
So take it out of the abstract. Give us an actual event that happened that looks like that.
So, and you know, I'm still looking for a specific event, but just in all the graphs we saw, there was like a 50% rise in the rate of increase of slavery from like 40 to 50, or 1840 to 50, and 1850 to 1860.
So how does that square with what Lizzie was saying? If this is about a fear that you're going to take away our slavery, the opposite's happening. To say, by the way, to add to that, the Abolitionist Party, by and large, was not about the Republican Party was not about abolition.
Yeah, but it was, they were united on that front.
Were they united on abolition? I thought they were united on
spread of slavery.
stopping the spread. That's different.
But that's what the southern states, I mean, like Bleeding Kansas was all about the spread of slavery.
So they secede because they're afraid of the stopping of the spread of slavery?
Well, I think they might have seen the spread, like that's just the first step in the line of abolition. Like the first thing to do is keep it from spreading, and then you're going to go in and try to get rid of everything else.
Can we talk about the Mexican-American War? Because that was between these states that we're talking about, smack in the middle. And they kind of connects all of what we're saying here. Like, they've expanded, like in 1830, I think if we just like compare the year 1830 to like what actually changed like in Congress and what laws were different by 1860, it might like, we might get a more clear picture here, but like the Mexican-American War opened up all this new land and like they're making these purchases, and this was after like significantly 18 years after 1830. So like why does that matter? Like there's all this new land opening and the Republican Party is emerging and they're like, we don't want slavery to spread. And for the South, it's almost like Ezra was saying, like the not hierarchy but the social comparison of like the way the North works and the way the South works. The northern economical expansion isn't based on what the government allows them to do. Like the southern economy that depends on slavery right now, their expansion is like they need slavery to spread for their success to like thrive as much as the North is with their factories. Like building a factory versus establishing a plantation with like many slaves, like it's very different. So like why using like the specific dates of the Mexican-American War, and like we know that the Republican Party like doesn't want it to spread, like how are those connected?
How are what connected? Just to make sure I understand you quick.
Like just like slipping in more events that happened in between, like there's more land opening up and
Yeah.
the way, kind of just like wrapping together the industrialization, the comparison of the two economies and like fitting it in with the time period, like the new purchases and the new land opening up, like what could agitate Southern slave supporters so much so that like seceding would seem like the only, not just a solution, but like the only solution. And is it the only solution to get what they want? Is it a threat? Do they really think it's gonna go through? Like I feel like we need to get inside their heads here, because like, are they really trying to secede, or are they just being like, we're gonna secede if you don't this? And
No,
like,
they actually seceded.
right, no, I know they actually do secede, but like there was no, were they looking for a pushback before they just like totally
No.
gave up?
That's a good question.
Like why, it's dangerous. Like their economy is totally based on slavery. The North is really successful. How did they know the North couldn't just take them over and wipe them out? Like they want to be their own country. What does that mean for them?
It's a good question.
Wait, I'm confused about how that point tied into the Mexican War.
That was an example of land opening up, and like, I'm just trying to find things that could specifically make them mad, and I was connecting to your point about the Republican Party and how like, just we were talking about how the, like, slavery completely ending versus not letting it spread is different, and how when land opens up, it's like a great economic opportunity if your economy is based on slavery, and like how that might feel for them, and like it would probably make them mad,
For one thing,
like not being able to spread.
I do believe that one of the issues with slavery, at least, is that it's a very old system. You know, it's been around for thousands of years, ever since some of the first civilizations popped up. But also, I think, at least from what we have read so far of the South, it's the slavery is a rather rigid system. It works a lot for farming, but I'm not sure about, you know, it could probably work in a factory. Actually, no, it can work in a factory. But
Slave people were rented out to all sorts of, it wasn't just cotton plantations, some of them were
Yeah.
rented out to
Yeah.
factory work, if that was something that did happen.
Yeah.
Mining, that's for sure.
But I do think that what industrialization has done is that it has also sort of created more room for future development of the northern economy, which the South probably could not compete with. So that could also be another reason.
So Shira was talking about like how the new land that acquired in the Mexican War, we were wondering about how that might have played into it. In 1850, in the timeline thing, it says that Henry Clay came up with a compromise, and so California would be free, but New Mexico and Utah territories would be decided by popular sovereignty. And it also says that both the North and the South denounced it, and the parties were split along sectional lines. And I wonder if that's both, the South and the North have the fear of, with popular sovereignty, they could lose a state. And so I think
They were worried about the same thing, but from
Right.
opposite sides.
right, and I just think that's interesting. They're both against it, but just for the reason they're
Wait, spin that out a little bit more. So you're saying you think that this new thing called popular sovereignty is something's going on with that?
Well,
Yeah.
you're saying it's scaring everyone.
I think it scares both sides because abolitionists.
Both sides,
Both sides
the
being the
North
North and the South, because the North would think, well, if the South wins, then that's another slave state, and that's not okay. But then the South thinks if the North wins, then we're going to lose our economy, and we already can't have the slave trade in D.C. And there are people are already placing, what's the word? People are already trying to prohibit us, and this is just going to prohibit us more. And so I think the idea of popular sovereignty scared both sides because they were fear of losing their
ideology. Do you think it justly scared both sides? Like, do you think both sides had an equal right to be scared? Almost like, who would lose more if it swung the other way?
Who would lose more?
Like, why do you think, like, why didn't the North secede instead? Why weren't they like, you know what, we want to not have slavery, and since most of us in the North here believe that it's immoral and wrong and we have our own economy not based on slavery, like, why wasn't it there, you know?
I think at the point of 1860,
Great question.
it was because Lincoln didn't necessarily want the spread of slavery, at least, and so
Right.
they thought, oh well, he's at least partially on our side. But both like if it had gone the other way, maybe the North would have been seceding.
Like, one more question, like, do
Yeah.
you think had whoever, like, Lincoln had not been born or had not been where he
Why don't we just
was
say
at that
elected?
time-
That's-
Okay, like, he just wasn't around as, like, a fierce advocate as anything, like,
I
he
don't
just wasn't in the
know that he was
picture.
necessarily a fierce advocate. I just think he was partially
Okay,
on our side.
had he not had the impact he had or been there when he was, like, and someone
was a
else,
pro-slavery
someone else had
president
been
at
there
that time.
instead right then, like, what would be different? Like,
what made Lincoln the final straw? I
well,
think that's what.
we're not saying it is, we were like playing with the idea that at that time what the North felt like they needed, possibly, to feel like they had an advantage in any way, was a
I think it's-
president that was like,
I think it's more about the South feeling like they had a disadvantage.
okay,
Because I think what you're asking me is if there had been a pro-slavery president in place of Lincoln, would the North have seceded? And we can't answer that, but certainly possibly.
or just would the South have not? Like,
Would
what?
the South have not? Well, I think it also, like, right, like you were saying, part of the reason the South seceded is they felt like their own government was against them, and so if
Right.
Lincoln had not been president, there's a chance that couldn't have happened because Lincoln, whether or not he was a fierce advocate, he was an advocate for at least the stop of slavery, and so he was the biggest figure in the country at that time, and so they were saying the biggest representative of our country is against our own ideals, this is
Right.
not okay.
Right. Okay.
So I think that has to do with why the
So,
South
like,
seceded.
do we not think it was ever like the North wanted to secede, the South wanted to secede? Like, it was never like an event where like the North threatened to secede from the South, like that's
They did.
in
Yeah, they did.
Oh, I missed
It was
that.
during the
1812.
1812.
Oh.
The
But even in the 1850s, so this is something worth keeping your radar out for because you're asking me such a good question. There were Northerners after Dred Scott who said, "Really, this is what the law
I never
demands."
knew it was that drastic that they.
Oh yeah. William Lloyd Garrison after the Anthony Burns story, the runaway enslaved person who the Bostonians tried to shelter from the fugitive slave law. William Lloyd Garrison publicly burns a copy of the Constitution and says this is a pact. This is a pact with hell.
I always like thought that was just like I never really
Like
thought.
the stuff being
If you
Well,
read in
yeah,
this like timeline, it says things like the parties were split along state lines, and like if we read now Southern and Northerner at this time period, we know
Right.
what their opinions are, and so I just think that shows like how sectionalized the country was.
Right, and then it's just interesting, like the South chooses to secede, but then like they have this war, and like you can look at it as the North like winning the South back, or like why did they even want them back?
Well,
Like,
so we'll get there, I promise. But that will be an important discussion. But for now, we're just trying to figure out why there's secession at all.
okay.
Yeah, that's fine. But so let's go. But I think you're really starting to hit on some answers here. So keep going. It's great.
I was kind of done with my point.
Not you necessarily. The group. But what made Lincoln the final straw? I think you guys that's a really important question. I think as you rightly point out, this guy is not by any stretch of the imagination an abolitionist. He's clear about that. So what's going on for the South that they say we're done? Like this guy's election is too much for us, we have to leave.
I think it could probably be maybe something that involves states' rights. It's like, sure, I can somewhat see the North seceding from the Union, but I think that they've spent so much, they spend so much time, and working together with one another, that they're more likely to try to cooperate or try to reach compromise with something. But with the South, they want, again, like with the whole nullification crisis, they hold their liberties over over the Union, and also like the tiny monument, for lack of a better word, with in Alabama saying we dare defend our rights. So I think it is with stopping the spread of I think it was also in the. I don't think maybe Lincoln was probably the last straw, but I think it was sort of a buildup of tension. Mainly, with the nullification crisis, basically revoking a state's ability to revoke a federal law, and also with the Kansas-Nebraska Act with specifically with popular sovereignty, and how most of the people don't want slavery to be in their states. That's maybe one thing that pushed them to secession.
Other was
Actually, Jonah, you had something to say?
yes. There's this handy dandy pie chart that some brilliant person decided to post in the document. I don't know who it was, but it's smart. It talks about how Lincoln's election wasn't like a major consideration in terms of the 4 states of Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, and South Carolina seceding, and that the majority of it was just slavery and slave rights in general. And so, I mean, I just find that interesting how.
But I think that kind of goes hand in hand with Lincoln getting elected.
And how did they measure that?
Yeah.
I explained that. They use so they look at the declarations of independence like that each state posts, and based on like the amount of times that each specific issue is mentioned, they decide which ones they care about the most. And Lincoln's election was not that. Like,
Maybe not, but it still happens. I think, Lizzie, this is your point. It happens right after Lincoln's elected.
Yeah, well, I also just think that like Lincoln's election and fear of slavery, like slave rights, kind of go hand in hand.
Right.
Like getting a president elected who is anti-slavery, like that's half of the reason why they hated Lincoln.
He's not anti-slavery, though.
And
He's not pro-slavery. He's not who they voted for.
I think the reason that this number is sort of misleading, well, or where its importance comes from, is that it doesn't drone on about, it would seem anyway, the tyrant Lincoln, blah 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 blah, because he really hasn't had the chance to do much of anything, it seems, at this point, and it really has to be more the thing he represents.
What does he represent?
Well, it seems like to the South, he represents all the other things that they put in this Constitution, like, states' rights and slavery.
What does slavery even mean? I mean, that's a word. That doesn't, what is...
I should define it.
No. But what does it mean to them that they're willing to secede over it?
I guess that just means, like, financial independence from the other states, but,
I feel like it's just like their way of life. Like I feel like it's less about slavery specifically. At like this point in time, it's more about it's who they are, and they don't want some rich, obnoxious people from the North telling them how to live their life.
which is funny because the rich, obnoxious people in the South.
I know that's probably,
Yeah,
but like I feel like it could have been reversed, and that like slavery was considered like the norm and accepted by everyone in the North, and they were trying to force everyone in the South to change, and the South would still not want. You know what I mean? I just feel like it's more just like not wanting the North to tell them who they are versus slavery itself. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I do want to get other voices in, but the question I'm going to ask you and not have you respond to, but think about and come back to is, what is the evidence from your perspective that the South was feeling that? That the South was feeling like, we are being told constantly how to live our lives, and we don't want, and this is something that we cannot abide by anymore. It's a theory, but I'd like to see that's something that genuinely did concern the South. So where do you see that playing out? Would be my question for you. Mike, you
This is sort of going back to the Lincoln question, but he made it clear that he wasn't an abolitionist, but he also said that he wanted to unify the country as either all slave or all free. And
you can say that.
Yeah.
You did say that.
Yeah. And I don't know, at least to me it seems like the trend at that point was sort of favorable to the free states, like the Compromise of 1850.
It was?
Pretty. Is it?
Sorry.
Is it?
I don't. No. I'm being facetious. But was it though? For real? For real? Because the trend. I don't know. Look at Dred Scott. That looks right.
Yeah. But the people voting for Lincoln were the free states. And just to go
I'm
back-
sorry, Mike. Yeah, that was really rude. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's okay.
Just because I don't know, the South probably felt like if the country was going to be unified as all free or all slave, they probably worried that it would be all free and they'd lose their slavery, and they were just sort of worried about it.
Yeah.
And also you said about Lincoln not being anti-slavery. Maybe he never said that, but he was viewed as being anti-slavery. Because in the timeline that you gave us, it said that he was called possessed only of his inveterate hatred of slavery and his openly avowed predilection of Negro equality. And that was like why they didn't like
And he didn't believe in either of those
Even
things.
if he didn't say those things,
So what's going
that
on?
was how he was viewed.
Okay, so why? What was going on that they would say things about him and view him that way that was just clearly not the truth?
Well, I feel like they might have been at a point where if you're not with us, you're against us. And Lincoln saying, like, I don't have a formal opinion, I just want the country to be united, could have been taken as, I want freedom.
I don't get this. Okay, so you guys have just actually helped me to crystallize something that I hadn't ever thought of before, and I appreciate this really deeply, so thank you. And Mike, your point about the trends, I think is so important. So here's what I'd love to hear you guys on. If you look at the trends, I think you might actually say that the trends actually are heading pro-slavery. No? I don't know.
Well, I was thinking about the Compromise of 1850, which sort of seemed to favor the North.
It did. They got the Fugitive Slave Act, which is like the whole federal government is now going to be behind their chasing down, and they do successfully in a number of occasions chase down and enslave people who have fled from plantations. And the federal government is willing to use its army to stop them. They're willing to use their army to shut down John Brown. They're using to use the federal army to do all sorts of things that are pro-slavery. And then the Supreme Court steps in and says, oh yeah, and by the way, you can bring your slaves wherever you want.
And then 2 years later, Kansas and Nebraska are popular sovereignty instead of being free states.
Yeah, they undo the Missouri Compromise. That's another good point. Yeah. So what's this about for the South? I think you're talking about trends is so important.
It's like they're not winning enough. Like they're winning, but like
So you're going to secede over not winning enough?
And also that Lincoln, was saying that we need an all-slave or all non-slave nation. It seemed like the South would, even though he was a northern elected president, just given how things are going and I guess how representation has been working there, that definitely isn't something the president could do alone. It seems like they would probably win the most out of Lincoln.
Not. Hold on, let's get some other voices who have not spoken.
So I kind of wonder, this is not necessarily an evidence-based thing, is if the South has fear over what would happen if their slaves were emancipated, because they've spent generations subjugating and torturing and killing and raping and torturing millions of people, and then they're just going to get freed, and what's going to happen? And one of the reasons they did that is, or to justify it, is, I think that it's even said in Dred Scott, it's that slavery is beneficial to a black person, and that they're somehow under human, subhuman, or below white people, and if
Yeah, they're enslaved for their own benefit,
right,
yeah.
for their own
yeah.
benefit. And so if maybe Southerners believe that they're trying to help slaves, but also if they were to be freed, would that mean that Southerners were wrong? And obviously they were wrong, but did a Southerner have that mindset of like, we can't be wrong, this is a good thing, so we have to save it?
So like on like an individual justifying their actions kind of thing?
Is it more about racism than slavery? Is that what you're, is that, I just want to make sure I understand.
I wonder if it's about keeping the racism and saying that we can't be wrong in this, and this has to be right because we've been doing this for generations. And like, people don't like to be wrong, right? And people don't like to realize that what they've done is wrong, and that maybe they thought for generations that black people were lesser, so they want to keep that, to know that they're right, even though they're not right. That's just what they think. Does that make sense? What I said? Does it make sense? I think I worded it wrong.
You're asking your classmates, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know.
Bless you.
Oppositionally, I'd like to put in the idea of the rise of Burkean conservatism. This idea that that change, regardless of how bad things are, needs to be extremely slowly implemented.
Say that again.
Change, if ever implemented, needs to be implemented extremely slowly. And so I think there might have been this belief that if slavery gets changed, maybe partially from what you were saying, that because slavery's been around for so long, we can't be wrong. But maybe also that our entire economy, our entire lives are based around this evil, but it's still based around it. So
My point is that I don't think that they think it's evil. I think they think it's right.
Well, they have so much to lose. It's everything to
Yeah.
them, and for the North, it's just a moral issue, and they
Yeah.
have a substitute. We're talking about who
The
would
North still had a stake in slavery. They had things.
Huge
valid,
stake.
totally
Huge
valid
stake.
and very true, but also it wasn't their main source of survival and money was coming from the slave trade.
Well,
And,
I'll just introduce you to
If you
one
were a
key
banker,
term.
yes. If you were a
This is-
factory worker, maybe not.
So
They
the-
had other things. The South didn't.
Well,
I'm only putting this on board because this is a new term they're having. This idea Southerners believed in this thing called King Cotton that we will never. Just to quickly get to your point about why there's a war, the Southerners said they're going to let us go in peace because we are so powerful, the slave states, because of cotton. They need our cotton so badly that they will never destroy us in a war. So it is significant. Anyway, so
I'm done.
I apologize.
I was just gonna say that there is reasonable concern for the economy if you abolish slavery tomorrow, right?
Which economy?
What? Everyone, the entire American economy. And
And the international economy to an extent.
yeah, and the international economy to an extent, not because slavery was, not because people in Europe are somehow need slaves to exist, but because everything in their lives was so deeply rooted in this thing.
So you think it was even more of a moral conflict? It was like a security blanket they couldn't let go of, and that was what it was? More than their economic dependency, it was
Maybe.
in them, so then that's talking about racism versus slavery. What do you think was more of a draw?
I don't know. I really do think the economy.
if the entire
Yeah.
economy,
Yeah.
if the whole country's economy, including the North, relied on it, then why did the South secede from the North? And why?
Stay the power.
Maybe, just going to the idea of the King Kong thing, that if we look at the trend which is coming up as symptomatic of, rather than something we have to just look at like the end result of just look at as the illness. Maybe the reason that we have those sort of Southern victories in like the federal government on the federal level or is because there is this northern over-reliance on Southern cotton and all that. And
you're talking about the federal government willing to throw its weight to behind the Fugitive Slave Act.
right, yeah,
And yeah,
it's
okay,
kind
yep,
of-
okay, yep.
And that's symptomatic of the South and Southern government leaders sort of realizing that they have this power, and that maybe because I know you said we weren't going to go into the actual act of aggression, but maybe that's why there would be secession without aggression, just so that they
What
could,
aggression are you talking about?
the Civil War.
Oh, the war.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
okay.
maybe that's why there would be a secession without sort of a conflict, because if I was a special interest group in the South, by which I mean like, a big plantation owner, what I would really want is if I could treat the North like an entirely different country just because I could be more mercantile with them. I could charge them significantly more than if we're all a part of the same federal government. And if it was my state government doing, and if I were involved in my state government, I wouldn't have to be taxed as much, for example. It could just be that there was, Southern business-led overconfidence in the North's dependence on them, and the assumption that the North would never fight back against them, that they could still exploit the North as economic partners who are just unwilling or incapable of, using the system. And it's that increase in power which lets them sort of do these things which prodded aggression with the North, on the federal level, or at least to support them or to push for them. And then that's what culminated in the secession, which they really just wanted to have so that they could sort of be, from this removed economic level kind of bastards to the North. Because they didn't want, the war really wasn't profitable for them. Or
Wait,
at
what
least
did they
wouldn't
want
have
to
been.
change economically?
So, because they're gaining power on the federal level, but it's still going to be more expensive for me as a Southern plantation owner to like pay interstate tax by moving my cotton north. What I would really want, because I'm very involved with the government, because this is a weird aristocratic. Yeah. This is one of those kind of societies where because I'm rich, I'm super involved in politics, where I'll probably get a cut of whatever money, and anyway, a smaller government is gonna pool away less of the taxes than me. If I could be in a separate nation dealing with the North as a separate nation, so we can set standard prices and jack up prices.
So you think it was they really did have deep economic motives for?
Well, yeah, and not just for like keeping slavery against a fear of secession. Maybe they weren't necessarily afraid of secession. They were afraid of continuing unity. They didn't want to be united just so that they could,
They felt like they could benefit more from governing themselves.
Right, exactly.
That
And then,
combo with their source of labor and economy. Okay.
And I also think that maybe just to go straight back to Lincoln, according to the Harvard Business School,
The article I gave you.
yeah, the article that you gave us for homework. It does, for one thing, one of the most famous things about Abraham Lincoln is that he often debated Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas is the same senator who created the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which gave popular sovereignty to both territories when they were supposed to be free states as of the Missouri Compromise.
What's your overall point on that? Okay.
Yeah, so
yeah.
now, and also he opposed the Mexican-American War, which many slave states supported because that would help them turn that soil into potential slave soil. And while he does now, he doesn't say that there is an inherent superiority to the white race when you compare them to the black race.
He says that.
Yeah, he says
Yep.
that, not me.
Yep, yep. No, I know that. No, I'm just clarifying that Lincoln does say that, yes.
Yes.
He doesn't reject that, he says it, yeah?
He does say in many of the debates with Stephen Douglas that slavery is an inherent evil that should someday disappear. So it's not as gray with Lincoln, and seeing him as president could represent a danger to the to like say the Compromise of 1850, which he could probably use an executive order to to get rid of it.
One more thing, going back to what Colby said, because I feel like we didn't fully like wrap that up. And I just have a question. What do you think it was about like this time that they, like, why couldn't, was it that they didn't see that they could economically prosper from self-government, or not self-government, so like having a smaller government, whatever it was, being divided, like, why
now?
what was that push, I guess?
Yeah, well, so I still think it definitely has a lot to do with Lincoln,
Okay.
just because of the time period.
It has to, because they do it right after Lincoln's
Right.
election, so
And
something's going on.
I think maybe more than the fear of slavery being outlawed, what they're afraid Lincoln will do is to unite the country more.
And they think that'll damage them economically.
Right, because it'll mean that there's like more equanimity between the South and the North, and because there's this sort of Southern pride of being like the producers, the breadwinners of America and all that, like it becomes more apparent to them that they can benefit from being separate, and they're probably best off being separate, and yeah.
Oh, we're in. Oh, wow. Okay. All right, guys. I'm really looking forward to seeing your timelines tomorrow and seeing which events you think are the truly important events and bringing about secession. That's what you guys are going to create for tomorrow. You look a little confused.
I don't want to leave in the middle of that.
No, the essay is going to be built out of the timeline.
But this is just like that hour.
The timeline is what you're going to do as a first step to getting. Well, today was the first step. Or, Yeah, guys, let me just be clear about this, guys, because I think, just so there's no confusion, you're all bringing to class tomorrow a hard copy of your timeline that has an explanation of why each event is significant in bringing about secession. That's what you're going to do. Yeah.
So like the assignment for Monday.
Yes.
It says like 3 to 5 pages you bring to the president.
So no, sorry, that it's just it's a long essay. That's all you need to, that's all you need to know.
Oh, so you want to like
Wait, so which things do you think, which things 3 to 5 pages that they do Monday or they do tomorrow?